I want to just start the evening a little early. I know we said 6:45, but I think everyone's excited to be here and anxious to get started. I did close the museum for the upstairs, but if the restrooms are still open, if you need to, get up and go ahead on in. My name is Joan Whitlow, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Mulliken House. And I first wanted to not only welcome everybody back, but also welcome the new members that we have. We have several new members in the audience, so I also want to take a moment to just thank everybody for volunteering this evening, not only with name tags. That was a last-minute decision because I believe some people thought we won't recognize everybody after a year, especially without a mask. And I also just want to thank all the volunteers who helped through the last winter months, because they've been really hard and it's been really trying, but I feel really good and confident that we're going to have a good summer ahead of us. I wanted to thank the Newburyport Brewery for donating this evening's assortment of beers, and also the New England Wine and Spirit Store for giving us a discount on the wine purchases. I know that this may be a disappointment on having those lovely platters, but with the reduction of touch points, we wanted to make sure that people had their own self-contained. So if you haven't paired your wine correctly, it's not my fault. This spring, when we were talking about the summer programming, we had hoped we could get outside with the first Friday. So here we are, success. But we also were talking in early spring, with all of the COVID restrictions in place, what could we do that would be something a way to engage the members? And everyone on the exhibitions and program team or committee decided that the best thing would be music. No singing, social distancing, and the sound will carry outside. So we have a series of concerts this summer, and we have Doug Hammer playing this Sunday. There's still tickets available. If you'd like to come and join our picnic dinner again, there's a theme here, bring your own, so I don't have to worry about serving food. But we're going to have a picnic concert here 4 to 6 on Sunday. Let's see where I am in this little script. So tonight we're here to talk, let me give a little plug for Doug Hammer. He's going to be performing a mix of his own music, American standards, jazz, ragtime, and pop music. He will do 2 sets with an intermission, and he is an award-winning musician, composer, producer, arranger, and an engineer. Who knew? But tonight we're here to hear about clocks. Bob Frishman is the owner of the Beveled Clocks. He's a scholar and a practitioner of horology, which is the science of timekeeping, for over 40 years. Do you have a clock that kept time for that, or did you just sort of come up with your own?
My clocks never worked.
Okay. they're only correct twice a day, right? So Bob has written many clock-related articles, and he's given many, many lectures over the years to many audiences. He's a fellow of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collection. He's the chairman of the NAWCC, that was just what I said, Time Symposium Committee, and the Freeman of Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. That's a London guild that started in 1631. So they've been keeping and making clocks for several centuries. Bob emailed me early in March and asked if we had a certain clock in the collection. He had sent a photograph, and right away I recognized it, and it was the 1770 clock that was in the Marquand room at the time. This was a bequest of Florence Evan Bushy, which came in the early formative years of the museum. I learned that Bob and Damon DeMauro were working on a comprehensive book about the Massachusetts Mulliken family of clockmakers. They asked if they could photograph the clock to be featured in their publication, which will be published by the Concord Museum. I believe in another year or 2 is when the exhibition is going to be on display. So we will loan this clock to go out to be part of a larger exhibition. Quite exciting. So Bob offered to donate his services, not only to restore the clock moving and get it working, but also to clean and sort of tidy up all the wood and the finials and really just, make it shine the way it is now. So thank you, Bob, for your donation, and also for presenting tonight's First Friday. Thank you.
Great, thank you for having me. And I even took my hat off, you know, and I got my hair done, so we should be in good shape since we're filming this. You know, I had to look my best here. And I'm glad you all had a chance to have some beer and wine, because I usually drink to make other people interesting. So I'm hoping that it works tonight too. So, and the talk's a little bit of a hybrid, because I'll give you a little bit of the flavor of a talk I give often, kind of about the history of mechanical timekeeping, but it's definitely going to be focused on the wonderful clock that you have here. But I kind of was hoping when I put this talk together that this is what I was going to see, because this is actually a photograph of Newburyport in 1915, a schoolroom. And just by coincidence, a friend of mine who knows I collect old photographs with clocks in them said, "Bob, will you be interested in this one? It's from Newburyport." And he had no idea I was speaking at Newburyport tonight. But it turns out that it's a classroom there by a photographer named Nye, Albert Nye, I believe. If anybody recognizes themselves in the photo, maybe you don't want to admit it. And I love the stuff on the blackboard too. And even the teacher looks kind of strange. So I'm not sure what's going on here. But and maybe it's not even Newburyport. But you're going to have to trust me on that. So. Anyway, this is not the crowd that I'm seeing here tonight, but it's sort of alarming, because I actually know people here. You know, and usually I don't in the group, so I can say anything, but I actually know people here, so this is more intimidating than usual. I live in Andover. This is the house I live in, which celebrated its 100th birthday a couple of years ago. And that's where I operate bell time clocks, although I'm not doing a whole lot of bench work anymore. I've repaired more than 7,000 clocks, and maybe that's enough. So I'm doing more, as you'll hear, more scholarly things. But for some too short a period, your Mulliken clock was in that house, and I was hoping that maybe this place would burn down or something. And, you know, although it doesn't look like it would burn, frankly. So I had to return the clock, but it was a wonderful addition to my house's foyer for the couple of months that I was able to enjoy it. That wasn't the reason I offered to restore it, but it was a lovely side benefit of having it there. So again, just a little bit of the usual talk, just so you understand kind of the context that this clock was created in and sort of where that context came from. But the name of my company is Bell Time Clocks, and back almost 40 years ago, when I was trying to think of a name for my business, I had just purchased this Winslow Homer engraving entitled Bell Time. It was in Harper's Weekly in 1868, and it's a view of workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time. And I thought, you know, this is a perfect thing for me to have, because there's no clock in it, but there's a bell tower, and it refers to the fact that factory workers at that time were really ruled by the bells that rang at the factory and told them when to arrive and leave, and if they were late, they didn't get to work, that kind of thing. So it suddenly dawned on me that the name of my business should be Bell Time Clocks, and it works for a lot of reasons. Even though a lot of people think it's bell tone and they're asking me about hearing aids. But I can tell them that they're at the wrong place, usually, unless they can't hear me. So that becomes a problem. So I'm glad, too, that Joan mentioned the, oh, come on in, folks, you didn't miss anything, really. Just the usual blather, but I'm glad that Joan mentioned that I am a freeman of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, and in fact, soon will be elevated to be a liveryman, which means that I then can drive sheep across London Bridge. And if I'm convicted of a capital crime, I will be hanged with a silk kerchief, not a hemp rope. So, that's the only reason I joined this place. So anyway, this is their logo, and just to prove that it actually happened, here I am being inducted by the master of this guild, again founded in 1631. The charter was signed by the king, and evidently they take anybody now, because here I am, but I'm being approved by the, welcomed by the master, and here I am signing the book, which as I took the oath, I realized I was swearing allegiance to the Queen. And I thought immediately my passport was going to get taken. Right? Here I am swearing, or else I was going to get shipped to the Falklands. Fortunately, none of that happened, but my name's in this, centuries-old book as one of these guys that supposedly knows something about clocks and horology. So, but almost the funnest part of all this is occasionally they have these dinners in these guild halls in London where, we all assemble, and I'm like the only guy without an English accent, but it makes sense. So it's just a wonderful opportunity to pretend I'm somebody I'm not for a couple of hours and be in London and around people that are a lot smarter than I am, or at least they sound that way because they have English accents. So that works out fine. But this is a boat that some of us came from England on, but as you recognize, this is the Mayflower. And this just allows me to talk a little bit about the history of clockmaking, because I often start by asking, how many clocks and watches were on the Mayflower? And the answer is 0, because at that time, clocks didn't work on the water. People who were on the Mayflower were not affluent enough to own clocks and watches. They told time in different ways. So that's the simple answer to that. And as you may know too, the Mayflower didn't land at Plymouth first. It landed in Provincetown. And that's a view of Provincetown Harbor, where if you'd been there in 16-something, you would have seen the Mayflower out there, but they decided that they couldn't afford the price of the hotels in the Provincetown. So they had to, they moved on to Plymouth, where there's a great Days Inn that they found, and that's where they stayed. So, timekeeping on shipboard and other places, one of the ways they did it was with sandglasses. So they would have a sandglass on ships. They were half-hour sandglasses, and those corresponded with the watches. If anybody was in the Navy or is aware of naval timekeeping, there were watches that were half-hour intervals. So they'd have a sandglass there near the helm, perhaps, and they would turn it over every half hour and ring a bell, and that's how they knew the guys to get out of their bunks and come and steer the ship. But they had an unfortunate possibility that was taken advantage of called eating sand, where the guy standing out there freezing his you-know-what off, steering this boat across the Atlantic, and he'd rather get in bed, he'll turn over the sand glass before it's empty. So, and if they did that long enough, you'd actually reverse night and day on the ship. So it couldn't work that long, but it was a function of something that happened there too. But of course there were, once we got to America and once towns like Newburyport reached a certain level of sophistication and affluence, they built churches, they built towers in the churches, and they often put clocks in those towers. And it wasn't just to see the time, because you can't hear it from that far away, but there were bells inside too that would announce to the people both what the hour was. So if you were meeting Samuel, at noon, you kind of had an idea what time noon was. And they'd also ring the bell if the Indians were coming over the hill. So they were, those were used for alarm purposes too. But of course, I'm sure you recognize this tower. It's here probably almost within sight. And Jack Santos was kind enough to take me up to the top of the tower without a rope. But I got back down too, fine. But one wonderful thing there, and maybe a lot of you know this already, but in that tower is a clock made by Paul Revere. Because Paul Revere's company he had a bell founding company in Canton, and that's where a lot of bells in the New England area came from. In fact, one in North Andover too, and that tower is a Paul Revere bell as well. And we also got to peek at the movement that's inside that tower. So this is the thing that's ticking away. This is not a striking clock. This is a one-train clock, but it swings a very long pendulum and ticks away. And fortunately, nobody has to go up there and crank that giant weight up every day or week. It's now electrified, which is a good thing. So that movement is up there, and that's typically what these movements look like. This is an old one, and there are ones that even older, like this one. This is at Salisbury Cathedral, and this is possibly 14th century, and it's the earliest known still existing tower clock movement. It's no longer in the tower at the church, but it's on display down below. And you can see that it's all iron. These things, before they were clockmakers, they really were just blacksmiths and other types of metal workers who made these giant timekeepers that again were used so that the local community could be on the same page, could know what time it was. There's a picture of Salisbury Cathedral where that clock is now in the first floor, no longer up in the tower. But there's another important church for the history of horology and of timekeeping. This is in Pisa, and if you don't believe me, there's the Prince Spaghetti Tower there. That's not trick photography. It actually is leaning like that. But the reason this is important is because a guy named Galileo, that's not me, that's Galileo up there. So, although there's a couple of guys here that look kind of like him too. But that's Galileo, and he, when he was age 19, he was inside this cathedral in Pisa, and he noticed that the altar lamp was swinging back and forth at a looked like a pretty constant rate. And he actually timed it with his pulse. He didn't have an Apple Watch, he left it at home. So he was timing it with his pulse, and he noticed that no matter how wide the swing of the lamp was, its period of oscillation was the same, went back and forth at the same rate. So he had the idea of applying this to timekeeping, because even that tower clock movement we saw from Salisbury did not have a pendulum. It had something else that rocked back and forth, not very accurately, like an hour a day accuracy was pretty good for those pre-pendulum clocks. So once you had a pendulum attached to a clock, it increased the accuracy 100-fold. And this is a model of the concept that Galileo produced for a pendulum clock, which pretty quickly was adopted later by this guy, Christian Huygens. His name sounds totally different when you say it in Dutch, but I've never been able to do it. It's like something like that. I tried, so we just say Huygens here, because we don't have the right mouth to speak Dutch, I guess, is the problem. So anyway, in the late 1600s, he applied essentially Galileo's principle to a timekeeper, and very quickly pendulum clocks took over from the older type, and you could suddenly do a whole lot more with timekeeping because you could be a lot more accurate. So on the left there you see the earliest style clock to which Huygens' pendulum invention was described, and he produced a book in Latin, which of course everyone here is fluent in, and so if I enlarge that, you can read it, I'm sure, but it tells all about how he applied the principle of pendulum timekeeping to timekeepers and made it all work. So, but up until probably 150 years ago, maybe even sooner, the real arbiter of time was the sundial, because clocks simply were not that accurate, and you didn't have GPS or radio or anything telling you what time it was. If for our local clockmaker, usually he made an effort to know the right time, and people would bug him all day going in there to set their watches and clocks. But really the arbiter at that time was a sundial. So as long as the sun was shining and it was daytime, you could essentially know the time and then set your watch and clock from it. And that relates to the story of Pocahontas. And you say, why the hell is he talking about Pocahontas? But it does relate, because the story, of course, is that Pocahontas saved John Smith when he was about to get his head beaten in by the Indians. But what actually saved him was that he was carrying a little pocket sundial in the shape of a globe, and he showed this to the Indians before Pocahontas showed up, and they were so intrigued by this they put off clubbing him. And then Pocahontas arrived and said, hey, it's not just a sundial, this guy looks good for other reasons. So that's how important sundials are to American history. And make sure you don't forget that. So there's another famous person too, Roger Williams. This is not a photograph, of course. It's a illustration of Roger Williams arriving in Rhode Island after they booted him out of Boston. Still have his pocket sundial, which is how he was able to tell time again as long as the sun was shining. So it's a nice artifact. Again, this is not me. This is Ben Franklin, and I mention him because, again, sundials were not only useful as instruments to tell the time, but they often were used in artistic depictions to show, the fact that timekeeping was important. And Franklin designed the first Continental currency after we decided we didn't want to be English anymore, even though the accent sounded so good. So we were, when we became Americans, this is actually at the beginning of the Revolution. This is actually called the Fugio cent, Continental currency. You see it's dated 1776, and it's showing a sundial with the sun shining on it, and Franklin's admonition to everybody looking at the coin, mind your business. And he's not saying mind your own business. He's not saying don't be nosy. He's saying take care of business. We got a lot of work to do. We're fighting the British. We're building a country, and we need to all, work hard and long to make sure that this place actually gets off the ground. So, and that's the point of this here. And Fugio means flying, like time flies. So he's reminding you that not only do you need to work hard, but you're not going to be here that long, so you better work hard while you're here. So not only was there a coin, but there was also continental currency too. We quickly ran out of silver and gold money, so we printed up a lot of paper money, which quickly became valueless during the inflation that resulted. But you can see also they used Franklin's design again with the same sundial and the same admonition on it to sell this to use this 1/6 of a dollar. And all these bills had to be hand-signed by selected people in Philadelphia. So you see a signature there, which I guess maybe helped with counterfeiting, but I doubt it. The British were great at producing even more of these than we did, and spreading them around to further damage the usefulness of the money. So not only were there clocks in towers, of course, but there were long case clocks, or as we call them now, grandfather clocks, even though that was a term that only originated in 1876 when a guy named Work wrote a song called Grandfather's Clock. And some of you may already now be singing it in your head about when the old man died, that kind of thing. But so before that, if you had gone to Jonathan Mulliken, for example, and said, I'd like to buy a grandfather clock, he would not know what you were talking about. So if you get in the time machine and go back to buy one, it's called a long case clock, a tall clock, or in this case, mostly, and you see these in estate inventories, they were just called 8-day clocks, meaning that they were weekly wind, because most of the smaller ones you had to wind every day. So if you said it was a 8-day clock, it meant it was a big standing clock probably that only needed winding once a week. So, and there are some nice clocks still in New England, a lot of them, and there's a couple that are at the Andover Historical Society that I helped them obtain. They bought, one came up at auction. I said, oh my God, an Andover clock, you're never going to see another one, you got to buy this. So, they scraped this money together and they bought it at auction. 6 months later, another Andover clock showed up at auction. But they bought that one too. And now no more have shown up, thank God. So we got the two that were out there. But I did an article about those clocks, and that was helpful to the Andover Historical Society, as I'm hoping to be helpful here as well. And tall clocks, again, were kind of symbolic of a family that had arrived and had enough money and sophistication and affluence to have a personal tall case clock in their house. And one of the things I look for are images of the past that have clocks and watches in them. This is by a Philadelphia artist named Krimmel, and this is what's called a frolic. These were kind of chaperoned house parties where young people could flirt under the watchful eyes of everybody, it looks like here. But you see that in the corner is a tall case clock. So, people reading the paintings back then would have immediately known, oh, this is a family that has some money, because a tall clock is there. It's like now, if there's a Bentley in the driveway, you figure, these folks have some bucks, or maybe they stole it, but either way it's there. So here's another example. This is also this is a Massachusetts scene. This is in Bolton, Massachusetts, by a Robert Peckham, who was a early 19th century artist. And And this is actually his family. This painting is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This is the Peckham Sawyer family. They're a combined family. But if you look at this closely again, it looks like it's a party. But because there's food out. But if you look, the shades are kind of down and people aren't looking all that happy. And that's because little Elizabeth, hope you weren't blinded by my green laser. Little Elizabeth had died about 3 months before this painting was done. So as was somewhat common in those days, this is a posthumous painting where they would often paint in the images of people who had died to indicate that they were still part of the family group. So this is little Elizabeth was in heaven, but they painted her as if she were still in the family. And again, you see a tall clock in the corner, and everybody got excited. Oh wow, you can actually see a name of the maker on the face of the clock. Let's look this guy up. But the name that's on the dial, at the time this painting was done, that clockmaker was 6 years old. So they have a continuity problem maybe there, but anyway, it was interesting to find that out. And this is one of my favorites, and this is Jamie Wyeth. So we're looking at a painting that's only about 25 years old. He painted this on Monhegan Island in Maine, where he had a place. And this was a young man that he used as a model often, whose name was Orca Bates. So that's Orca Bates, but he's there with another American tall case clock. And I have met Jamie Wyeth, and he says they still own the clock. So and it's still up in the house in Maine. They're not in the house in Monhegan anymore, but the clock is still up there. And I actually one of my jobs, my other volunteer jobs, is as she mentioned, as head of the Time Symposium for our collector group, is I create symposiums every year for us that are usually international. People come from all over, and this was the one that I created that was at the Museum of Fine Arts in 2017. And I had some great speakers, and they all talked about different aspects of this whole subject of horology and art. And while you were waiting for us to get started tonight, I was running the slideshow of the more than 2,000 images I have of fine art images that have clocks and watches in them. If you have some time later tonight, I'll come back and show you all 2,000. Sounds like my voice won't last that long though. But of course there were a proliferation of tall case clocks, not just by Mulliken, but by many makers, including Simon Willard, who's perhaps one of the most famous names, based first in Grafton and then in Boston. So this is a Simon Willard tall clocks, and he's probably the best known name, and he's probably the best name that's put on clocks that he didn't make. There's a whole essentially a problem, but even back in his day when he was alive, other clockmakers put his name on the clocks in order to get more money, or to prove that, or to fool people to think they were buying a Simon Willard clock. They say and he had brothers too, Aaron and Benjamin, that also made clocks. They said if the Willards made every clock that has their name on it, they'd still have to be working now to make all those clocks. So we have a problem. But this is your Jonathan Mulliken clock, and you'll certainly see more pictures of these. Thank you. This is the vodka, right? I drink to make myself more interesting. So this is the Mulliken clock that we'll look at again. But as you see, it was of a style, and perhaps at least in the front you can see some of the names, that this was a style of clock case that Jonathan Mulliken was not unique in using. And of course Jonathan Mulliken had nothing to do with the case. He was the maker of the clock movement, the machinery inside, and the cases were always made by local cabinet makers and joiners. But you can see it's a common style, and these are other maker names that you see here, including a couple of other Mullikens. Daniel Balch, I'll mention, is another local clockmaker, and even Edward Duffield, that I'll talk about, who's a Philadelphia maker. So you can see, there were styles like there are now with furniture that would come from different makers. Even Thomas Tompion, who's called the father of English horology, this is a clock that's probably 80 or 100 years older than your Jonathan Mulliken clock, but it's, again, you can see that the style is quite similar. I won't start drinking yet. So in talking about Jonathan Mulliken, this is an early ad that he placed in 1774, which just tells you how he was advertising his services then. I won't wait for you to read it. I hate when people put text on the screen because then you're supposed to read it or not. So you won't see a lot more text, but just to show you that he was active in this area and he was making, selling, repairing clocks at that time. Jonathan Mulliken also was an engraver. A lot of these guys needed other jobs besides clockmaking because clocks were expensive and there weren't enough rich people around to keep them working all the time. So they would do other things. But what he did, one thing he did was after the little ruckus we had in Boston called the Boston Tea Party, an artist named Henry Pelham created a scene of, I'll get that, let's say, created and engraved, drew a scene of the Boston Massacre. Within a couple of days, Paul Revere stole the image and engraved it and put out a print of the Boston Massacre that was propaganda, essentially. None of it happened like that. And in fact, John Adams, as you may know, is the lawyer for the British soldiers who were tried for murder, for killing these rowdies that were out there attacking them. But in the Paul Revere version, you'll see this is actually a twofer, because this also has clocks or timepieces in it. Because you see one, there's a nice dial on the face of that, but also on the face of the old State House was a sundial. So that there were often sundials mounted on the buildings, the side of buildings like that. So this shows two things. But Paul Revere was in such a rush to get this printout that he got the time wrong on the clock. It was wrong by 2 hours when the Boston Massacre happened. So he actually then rushed out a second version of the print. But lo and behold, like 2 weeks later, Jonathan Mulliken copied Revere's print and also tried to sell it because I guess everyone wanted to see what didn't happen at the Boston Massacre. So this is Jonathan Mulliken's version of the Boston Massacre. If you find one of these at a yard sale, it's probably good to snap it up because the last one sold for about $30,000, I think. So the Paul Revere ones go for like $200,000. So, you know, I guess he's got something over Newburyport. But anyway. And speaking of symposiums, my one this year is this one. It's taking place in Philadelphia at the Revolution Museum, and it's all about clocks, watches, and timekeeping during the American Revolution. So if you'd like to come to Philadelphia in October, it will be a great event. You don't have to sit through all of it. You can go get the ice cream too. But it's a good, it'll be a fun event. And again, I have good speakers speaking about all kinds of things related to timekeeping and the American Revolution. In fact, this is a photograph I just took of George Washington. And at Valley Forge, somehow it doesn't look as rough as it should if it's Valley Forge, but this is some artist's depiction of life at Valley Forge for George Washington. So, and of course, right nearby, another building that's sort of from that time and connected to it is this house that was built for Mulliken, but unfortunately he didn't live to live in it. But there's the house there, and you have other associations to the Mullikens, certainly, besides the clock that's standing there. I have pictures of some other Mullikens, because as she mentioned, and as I'll mention again, Damon and I are doing a book about Mulliken, so we're already trying to collect images of Mulliken clocks, which is why we're very interested in this, because it certainly will be in the book. But I already have, between all the Mullikens, I have images of more than 190 Mulliken clocks. Not all by Jonathan, maybe about 30 by Jonathan. But these are pictures of some of the Jonathan Mulliken clocks that I've been able to find pictures of. And you see they differ in appearance because, again, the person who was buying the clock decided what the case was going to look like and how fancy and impressive the case was going to be. So they varied in quality of woods and quality of adornments and all too. So there's, again, other version. This one has sort of the broken arch effect as opposed to the other kind of pediment that we saw before. And I like this one because this is Jonathan Mulliken, but instead of saying Newburyport, exclusively it says New England. In case you didn't know where Newburyport was, you know, he got the New England in there too, which I don't see that a lot, and it's kind of nice to have seen it. This was for sale at a dealer whose shop is right near me, but it was like 2 years before I was interested in Mulliken, so somebody else had got it. Otherwise, maybe I would own this clock. Sorry, my wife is not liking the sound of that, but, but anyway, it got by me, and someone else is lucky enough to enjoy it now too. Here's another Jonathan Mulliken clock, and again, a few more. So you see that he was busy, and his movements, the clock, the part that he made, are in a whole variety of case styles. So there's an interesting variety. This is just from an old Sotheby's catalog, and you can see even way back here, this one sold for $17,000. So there were people who were certainly interested then and now in Mulliken clocks. There are about, 6 of them for sale at Delaney's Clock Shop. It's in West Townsend, Mass. I think there's only 5 now because Damon bought one, but but there are some there. If you need to own a Mulliken clock, there certainly are ones there, but they are expensive. I offered Joan, $300 for hers, but no, she didn't go for it. So there's one very important Jonathan Mulliken clock, which again my collaborator Damon tracked down, and then we actually found the owners and found the clock, or Damon did, and fortunately it was nearby in Sudbury, Mass, so we were able to go see it and photograph it again for the book. And the key thing about this is that it says Jonathan Mulliken, Falmouth, and it's the only known one by him when he worked in Falmouth, Maine, and it dispels this whole family mythology that there was an older Jonathan Mulliken who maybe had taught the younger ones, because this clock clearly was made around the same time period as your Jonathan, and by the same guy. It wasn't by another older Jonathan. So it was a very important clock to find, and we were very happy to know about and be able to photograph it. The clock just now went to Arizona, where I've assured the owners it will fall apart within a year. So, because the no humidity going from New England summer to Arizona, I mean, people have documented this, where the wood dries out almost instantly and you have almost a pile of kindling pretty soon. But I'm not sure they believe me, but they're going to find out, I guess. So of course, there were many other members of the Mulliken family that were clockmakers, and also other Newburyport clockmakers. So again, this is the thing I say I won't do, which is throw text on the screen, but I'm not going to read it all like people do with PowerPoint presentations. I'm not going to read, but just to show that there were other Newburyport clockmakers at work at the same time and in the same period, not just Jonathan, because it was an affluent community, and this area had enough money to support clockmakers who could do their work, and they've been of interest over the years. The Boston Clock Club, which operated in the 30s for quite a long period. This is in 1937. James Conlon gave a talk about Newburyport clockmakers. I always grit my teeth a little bit when I say James Conlon names, because there's a ton of Willard clocks out there that James Conlon made. So it's in fact, there's a lighthouse clock at Winterthur, which Henry DuPont bought as a Willard lighthouse clock, and they've come to realize it was made by James Conlon. He made great clocks, he just didn't make Willard clocks. He made James Conlon Willard clocks. So, but he was quite an expert. You have to be pretty good to make believable fakes, and he was very good at it. So, and there's another book again that focuses on Newburyport clocks. So you can be proud, if you're from this town, that it was a center of clockmaking. Not to quite the extent of Boston at the time, but there were important clockmakers here too, who often went to Boston to buy parts and exchange information and material with the Boston clockmakers. Here's the dial of the clock, and some people call it a face, but the real name of it, if you want to impress people, is you call it the dial, because that's what we call it too. So it's actually a composite dial, and later clocks that you might have seen, older tall case clocks that were painted white with the numbers painted on them. Those were improvements, and they were cheaper and they were easier to read at night. But at the time this was made, this was a composite of a flat hammered brass sheet with these beautiful intricate cast spandrels on the side, and the boss up on the top with the maker name on it, the silvered chapter ring, so these are all silvered brass, so again it would reflect light, make it easier to see. So there's the dial of the clock that's sitting in the museum. And I'm showing this picture because Again, the spandrel, those decorated corner things. Mulliken was not there with his jackknife, carving these out of wood and molding them or sawing them out of brass. These were stock items purchased from England. And the picture you see there, number 41 in a reference book I have of spandrels that clockmakers could buy from England, is the spandrel that you see on the dial. So he was making that. Sometimes clockmakers would take an original and use it as a mold to cast other ones, but usually you can tell because those look kind of sloppy because the molding wasn't that accurate. So anyway, you have a Mulliken clock, but it has some English components, which is not surprising at all for the time. So there's the back of the dial, and you see the date ring too, because in the front of the dial, there's a little window at the bottom that shows the day of the month, and that's worked just because that's on the other side of that toothed ring you see there that moves ahead every day being pushed along. So there's the back of the dial, there's the weights. These clocks are weight driven. Essentially it's gravity that's pulling on those gears that makes the clock tick and makes it strike every hour. So these are heavy, 8, 10, 12, 14 pounds, depending. A lot of them were melted during the War of 1812 to make bullets. So you often see later weights that are sometimes just cans, soldered together cans with sand and rocks and things inside. But these are older, better looking weights, so they could be the original. There's the pendulum disc, or bob. It's the pendulum bob, not named after me. So that's the front. This is the disc that swings back and forth. And the pendulum length, if it's about 39 inches long, is what's called the royal pendulum, because it turns out that according to physics, a pendulum of that length swings back and forth each way once a second. So it's very easy to have a clock showing seconds because you don't need any extra gearing to make that second hand go around once a minute. So a pendulum that's 39 inches long ticks seconds, and that was very convenient for a lot of reasons. There's the back of the pendulum showing how it's just kind of a blob of metal that they then nicely faced with brass to make it look pretty from the front. And there's the movement, the face of the movement when it was back together again with some of the parts missing, but I made it work anyway. Just kidding, Joan. So again, this is the front of the movement, and it's a whole nother lecture to tell you how these things work, but it's all quite ingenious, and the design is 400 years old, 300 in some cases, but this is the front of the movement, and those steel parts that you see there all relate to the striking system so that it knows how many times to strike when it's told to. So this is a Simon Willard movement. So you can see there isn't that much difference. These were standard type things. A lot of them came from England. A lot of the parts came from England and were assembled here. It was a standard design in rectangular plates with the gears suspended inside. There's a side view showing it, the series of gears. And basically what you have is a transmission. You have 12 pounds of whatever pulling on the gears, and the power is stepped down, because if you just had the weight on that one wheel and you let it go, zing, it would go to the floor in 10 seconds and all the power would be used up. But if you step it down through a series of gears, and the small gears called pinions, you stretch out the time that it takes for all that power to get dispersed as the weight goes to the bottom. And if it's an 8-day clock, it takes a week for the weight to go to the bottom, while in the meantime it's doing the ticking and doing the striking. So it's now you all can be clockmakers because you know how it works, right? Yeah. They're easy. And these are all the parts. So and this is always fun for me to take pictures of the parts, and so that you can see. And some of these actually are parts made out of other parts, so this isn't totally stripped down to every last bit. But this is, this is as far as I go because the rest of the stuff doesn't need to come apart. But these are the parts, and everything got taken apart to get the decade and more of accumulated dirt and dried oil and all, which is why clocks stop, because they just get dirty. They're machines and they need to get cleaned. It's not because some gremlin dropped out of the sky and told your clock to stop, or it's not because the old man died and the clock never worked again. It's because they're just like your car. You don't change the oil, eventually it doesn't work. Same with clocks. They need to be taken apart, and this one was taken apart and everything was cleaned and put back together and made to work again. But there were some lovely things about this, and actually I should back up a little bit, because if you look at the tops of the plates, so here, That's quite unusual. Almost always they're just rectangles. So for some reason, Jonathan got fancy here and made the top of the plates sort of fancy. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it's 5 pillars. If you look here, usually there's just 4, and that's plenty, but 5 keeps it even more stable, and that helps with preventing wear and making it run a little better. So this is a 5-pillar movement, which is impressive too. So there were some nice things about this clock that put it above the ordinary and nicer, frankly, than a Simon Willard clock, as long as no one hears me say that. So, and including little touches like this. So you look, this is one of the strike lever pieces, but just that little sort of beveled design there in brass on the steel. You know, there's no functional reason for him to do that at all. It would work just as well if he just sawed it off square. But that extra little flourish there was lovely to see, and it just shows that he was putting some extra attention and care into making this clock. And again, when we talk about clocks being handmade, you know, and this sort of was handmade, but you get the wrong image, because you picture the guy there with the candle and his Bowie knife, you know, cutting out these gear teeth. But they could never have made clocks like that. They needed a specialized equipment to do things like cutting the teeth on all those gears. You just couldn't do it by hand effectively. So they had gear cutting machines, and this is one from the period, but this is English, and maybe the Mullikens didn't have a machine this nice, but it's possible they had one like this, because this is what's at the Willard House, in the Willard House shop that's still there, and they have some of either the tools the Willards used or ones that like the ones Willard used. So this again was a gear cutting engine. So that disc on the bottom would move one step at a time, so you would get the right number of teeth, because if you're trying to cut 60 teeth in a wheel and you're doing it by eye, the odds are that when you get to the 59th tooth, it's not going to be in the right place. So, so you need something like this. So no doubt, and I think we know, the Mullikens had this kind of equipment because they would have had to in order to make the kind of clock that you saw there. They couldn't have done it by hand, you know, in a way that maybe sounds primitive and impossible almost. So this is the Willard House. It's a wonderful museum down in Grafton. I encourage you to go there. They have more than 60 beautiful Willard clocks there. No Mullikens, of course, but some Willard clocks. It's a great day trip. It's near Worcester. I encourage you to go there. I don't get a commission on the tickets if you go there, so you're okay too. But the other thing that has to be done is you have to, and especially when you're repairing, is you then polish things and clean things and put them on a watchmaker's lathe in order to polish the parts that turn so they're very smooth and clean. So occasionally I have young people and even old people who want to learn how to do clock repair, and this was a girl who decided that, like, for her year school project, she wanted to learn about clock repair. I mean, I was sort of surprised, but then her mother told me, well, last year she did welding. So I think, all right, I guess this is going to work out. And she was great, and she came, you know, like every other Saturday, and we did stuff. And you see her now where she's essentially polishing a pivot using my my watchmaker's lathe to get everything nice and clean and smooth. I don't know what she's doing this year. Maybe, you know, what would be something else that she would do? Surgery, yeah, that's right. So she's gone way past clockmaking. So, but one thing I noticed too, another part is this is the snail, and you can see why it's called that, but this also determines how many times it strikes. But I noticed something on here that caught my eye instantly. Is that those little edges there on the steps are beveled. And people would do that occasionally because it would help if you set the hands backwards. If it were beveled, you might not break the thing off that otherwise you would break off if you set the hands backwards. So this has these little beveled steps there. And I had another clock which also had those beveled steps, and I think, this is great, it's unique, I've never seen this before, and now I'm seeing another one, and I'll tell you about it. But here's a snail which does not have the beveled steps, and 999 out of 1,000 snails do not have those bevels on them. And so there's one that does. But here's the one that was on the clock that I owned that had these bevels and got me all excited and said, wow, this is, you know, unique, amazing. And then Jonathan had to come along and do the same thing, like 40 years earlier than my clock. But anyway, this is my clock was made by Rufus Porter. And some of you may know that name because he was better known as a muralist who traveled around New England and would go, he was an itinerant artist who would go house to house when they were asked and paint murals on the walls as opposed to wallpaper because it was cheaper. So I got lucky at an auction and I bought a Rufus Porter clock, mainly because it said Billerica on it. And I lived near Billerica. I said, oh great, a local clock. And that started me on this huge slippery slope of Rufus Porter. And you know, I got way deeper into it than I ever should have, and I have lectures and everything about Rufus Porter too. But he did that beveling on the snail. So there's the only known image of Rufus Porter. He was an incredible polymath. He was the founder of Scientific American magazine. He was an inventor of all kinds of things. And there, whoops, didn't mean to do that. So we'll get back to, there's Rufus Porter again. And occasionally there's been revivals of interest in him, and at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, they recently did an exhibit all about Rufus Porter. They produced a lovely catalog about it, and they borrowed my clock. There, the two curators, smiling admiringly, one at me, one at the clock. You can see which is which. I never liked that guy anyway. So. But Laura is great. So anyway, there's my Rufus Porter clock. But I had the idea after the exhibit closed, that I really shouldn't have this clock. The Rufus Porter Museum in Bridgeton, Maine should have this clock. I'd visited there, I'd spoken there already, and I said that they really should have it. So I offered to them at my price. I didn't make any money on it, and I offered to deliver it and set it up. And there it is now in the Rufus Porter Museum up there. And it was donated by the husband of the woman that's standing right next to it, kind of in her name. He paid for the clock, and it's now standing there where it belongs. So I feel like Rufus, maybe if he's up there, he's smiling down at me that he's with all his other stuff now. You know, he's not standing next to Willard anymore. You know, he's with his other stuff. So that's a good story. So of course, as I mentioned, the Mullikens, there were a number of them. This is a family tree of how they came out, and again, my collaborator Damon is the genealogy and family history part of this package. And the book will have a lot, at least as much about the Mullikens as a family as it will about the clocks. So it's going to be an important kind of genealogical study of them too. But again, there were several of them, and they made clocks. This is the Nathaniel Mulliken clock. That's an example. Again, you see it looks quite similar to ones that were made here. And this is the another Mulliken clock by Samuel Mulliken, and it now lives at Damon's house. And if you'd like his alarm code, I think I have it. So, I know when he's going on vacation too. But actually, there's the dial of the Samuel Mulliken clock. It's a lovely early example, and the exciting thing about it too is that it was made in Bradford, which is, you know, is part of Haverhill, and Damon lives very close to where this clock was made in Samuel's shop. So it's a wonderful thing for Damon to own as well. And there's his clock taken to bits. We had fun doing it together. If you were counting, you might notice that there are fewer parts in this one, because Damon's clock is a 30-hour clock, which was how they referred to clocks that needed to be wound every day. And you didn't need as many parts, as many gears, for a clock to run one day as opposed to 8 days. So there were fewer parts there, but there's other significant differences too. There's no rectangular plates. It's just these little cross-shaped pieces that kind of held the movement together. So you know, it's great that Damon wanted that clock, because it gave us an opportunity to do some forensics on another Mulliken clock too, and take it down to pieces, not just the one that Joan was kind enough to let me disassemble here too. So there's just a mock-up of our book cover. I also mentioned Ed Kane, because Ed Kane is a guy who lives in Concord and elsewhere who loves to fund clock-related books. So he's somebody I've come to know, and he's funding another book that I'm writing, but he's also funded other important clocks, books about clocks. This is one example. Stretch, they were like the Mullikens, they were a whole family of clockmakers. They were in Philadelphia earlier than the Mullikens, but so he funded that. And you see the authors' names down there, Don Fenimore and Frank Homan. Don Fenimore is an emeritus curator at Winterthur. Frank is a collector and also a guy with a lot of money. He has, I think, about 60 American tall clocks. This may be his stretch clock on the cover. I can't quite remember. So there's one example of another clock book that Ed Kane funded, and a difference to, and also this Clagged book. The Claggets were in Rhode Island. They made beautiful clocks as well too, and they did a wonderful book about that recently. And there was even an exhibit of Clagged clocks at the Redwood Library down there in Newport, again, which is where these clocks were made. So there was a whole package there. And again, it's really thanks to Ed that all this happened. Those are the two authors, Frank Homan and Don Fenimore, allowing me to take their picture, because I also kind of moonlight as a reporter sometimes. So I wrote about this clock exhibit for me in Antique Digest and took their pictures, and they were smiling because I told them to. So, yeah. So the other book I'm doing, first before Mulliken, again funded by Ed Kane, is about Edward Duffield, who I mentioned earlier. He was an important clockmaker in Philadelphia before the American Revolution, and it's been a wonderful trip for me to study Philadelphia history and Edward Duffield at that time. That book will be published by the American Philosophical Society, and they own a surveyor's compass, because sometimes these clockmakers made scientific instruments as well. So this is a Duffield signed surveyor's compass that's in the collection of the Philosophical Society. That's their building in Philadelphia. You know, that was founded by Ben Franklin many centuries ago, and that's a venerable old institution. And I'm of course very proud that my book will be published by them if it's any good. So I need to make sure it's a good book too. But of course, that's something that when you come to my symposium in October, you can also go to APS and visit them too. It's a wonderful place. So we're about at the end, and I like showing this image at the end. This is one of my horology and art images. It's hard. I'm going to show you a close-up in a minute, so don't worry if you don't see the clock. But this is the top of Mount Mansfield, the tallest mountain in Vermont. And this is a climbing party in the 1860s that was captured as they got to the top. But if you get the close-up, you see that one of the guys there is holding his watch up and saying, you know, it's getting a little dark out here. You know, maybe we ought to head down the mountain. So that's sort of the way that I decide that it's time for me to stop talking and that it's time to stop. But I hope some of you got to look at the clock, the Jonathan Mulliken clock, in place in the museum. This is the picture I took after we set it up there in the wall and tried to make it in a way that it can't fall over. And I think we did a good job with that. It hasn't fallen over yet, right, Jim? All right, that's a good thing. So, you know, I hope that this helped you all sort of appreciate it more when you go to see this lovely clock now. It's a great example of American New England clockmaking. It's a great example of things, important, sophisticated things that were made here in this town. And it's been a wonderful thing for me to have an opportunity to handle it and to study it and then to be able to talk about it. So the final slide, of course, I'm thanking everybody, including Jonathan Mulliken, for letting me be here tonight. All right, any questions?